For a game that's only existed for not even 2 years, Hollow Knight seemed to have been the very definition of a sleeper hit. Having come from a team of developers with very limited numbers and resources, Hollow Knight's success is a testament to the idea that you don't need a fancy $100 million budget or a team of 60 overworked employees to make your game as entertaining as it can be. Hollow Knight's Team Cherry have consistently shown their generosity and their passion for their fanbase through a quadrilogy of free content updates, showcasing fan art, and being as in touch and as open with the game's community as their time will allow. I'm Rusty, and it's time to sit down and delineate the full timeline behind how Hollow Knight came to be. Let's get started. Starting way back with Team Cherry's first couple of projects, Hungry Knight and Tomb Cat, which if we're discussing the history of Hollow Knight, we can't leave out. Hungry Knight, Team Cherry's very first project, was actually the byproduct of a game jam that the team participated in. And to anyone that's unfamiliar, game jams are events in which smaller development teams will create very simple games, usually having to do with a common theme. The one catch is, your time is very constricted, and dev teams that participated in these jams are almost never given any time past 3 full days to complete their project. So if you're wondering why Hungry Knight and Hollow Knight looked completely different in terms of quality, then that's because Team Cherry had barely around 48 hours to make this entire game from the ground up. The theme with this particular game jam was 10 seconds. The 3 guys took this theme and decided to create a character that needed to be fed every 10 seconds, hence the title of the project, Hungry Knight. As you fight your way through a minimally designed wasteland, your knight was to keep itself fed as you do battle with 3 masked enemies. Defeat them and collect their masks, and head back to the shrine in which you spawned, and you will see the 3 masks, which I'm assuming was what eventually became the 3 dreamers in Hollow Knight, have all congregated here at this shrine, signaling the end of the game. After the game jam was over, Team Cherry apparently fell so in love with the simplicity of the knight's character design that they eventually decided the knight should be involved as the protagonist in a much larger project. The second game, Tomb Cat, was created and developed as part of Indie Speedrun 2013, a game jam event held by Escapist magazine. Tomb Cat was made for this game jam despite not making the deadline. Some of the finalists included games like Secret Formula and Puss Platypus. Okay, I didn't choose the names, that's just what came up. Indie Speedrun 2013's game jam decided to settle on the theme of greed and mummies. So right off the bat, Team Cherry decided that an Egyptian-themed project would likely fit the theme best. Tomb Cat ended up being a side-scroller about a tomb-raiding, crypt-robbing cat named Kara that collected coins in a limited amount of time. The game had a simple and really effective difficulty curve. The more pyramids you raided and the more levels you completed, the harder the game became and the less time you received for each level. Although these 2 games are rightfully considered extremely important parts of Team Cherry's development history, we actually can branch out even further than this and talk about what some of the team was involved in entirely outside of the gaming industry. Mechanical Apple, for example, was an award-winning animation studio fronted by 2 guys, one of which you probably recognize. Ari Gibson and Jason Pemont were both dedicated to telling animated stories with passion, creativity, and heart. After relaunching with a new website in 2012, Mechanical Apple began posting news updates and blogs centered around what short films they were working on next. This included a relaunch of one of their earlier animated short films, Winter Fox, which followed the perspective of a young fox in the middle of a snowstorm trying to find its way back to its family. Later, the short film Motorbike, animated by the same 2 people, eventually found its way to Disney, where the company even featured the short film as a Disney favorite. The music score for Motorbike was composed by a man named Christopher Larkin, who a lot of you probably are already familiar with. Christopher is going to get mentioned quite a lot in this video because little did Ari know, this animated film would not by any means be their last project together. And for the next few years, it was nothing but pedal to the metal, breakneck grinding for Team Cherry, as they immediately shifted their focus to a project in which they considered to be their magnum opus. Hollow Knight is a traditional side-scroller that is anything but traditional. It shares the theme of their previous 2 games, in that you, as the player, are tasked with exploring a strange, really esoteric world in which you know nothing about. But as the game continues, this simple tradition is soon broken, and the game begins to developing its own unique qualities. It's also important to know that Rowan Fraser, although not officially listed as part of Team Cherry on their website, has a very critical relationship with Hollow Knight. There are also multiple interviews in which Ari and William do in fact confirm that he is a member of the team. Upon beginning production on the largest project any of them had ever been involved in at this point, the team begins its grind. A new website for Team Cherry is launched in accompaniment with their divulging of their new game, Hollow Knight. The team began their first blog posts by giving virtual tours through some of the more important levels of their game, including the King's Pass and the Forgotten Crossroads. The official teaser trailer came soon after that, and it is important to remember that during the latter half of 2014, Hollow Knight actually started its progress under a more beginner-friendly video game engine called Stencil, and this continued for a good year or so up until Team Cherry decided to scrap the game engine and move to Unity because it allowed for the addition of more content, visual effects, and just all around could deliver a much more polished game. In fact, the very first teaser trailer was actually game footage you were seeing in the Stencil engine. Some of their other early blog posts included a quick summary of some of the most common enemies you would see and fight in the Hallownest Kingdom, and it's actually quite interesting to see how the wildlife of the game evolved up to this point, because almost all of the names that were used in this earlier post would eventually either get modified or just changed around completely. The crawlid enemy used to be called the Snittering Crawlid, also names like Segmented Clamberbab and Demon Sapien, and the Humming Knit. Yeah, the primal aspids actually used to be called humming knits. I don't know, it's weird. One enemy in particular, called the Blundering Obelisk, actually didn't even see past its prototype stage, and never even made it into the game. Hollow Knight was turning out to be a pretty fun project for the team, but it wasn't until they announced their Kickstarter when they realized just how seriously the fans were actually taking this project of theirs. Hollow Knight eventually garnered an overwhelming amount of publicity when the game was actually staff-picked by Kickstarter's website, and not soon after that, Hollow Knight receives the winning vote around November of 2014 to be greenlit on Steam's website. Suddenly, fans begin asking questions, thirsty for more information on the details of the inner workings of the game, and it was at this point when people were really beginning to take this project seriously. This was around the time when their second trailer, A Weird and Wonderful World, dropped on YouTube, followed by a slew of positive announcements on the progress of the game, including the raising of over 60,000 Australian dollars on Kickstarter, the promotion of an official Hollow Knight figurine made by David Patron, adopting a new game engine, an office upgrade, and the addition of a couple new team members that would become absolutely critical to Hollow Knight's success. Dave Kazi is an experienced programmer and project manager that Team Cherry believed would throttle game development and productivity to a level the team had never seen. And with the help of a familiar name, Christopher Larkin, positioned as the lead audio engineer for the game, Hollow Knight seemed to have all the tools in place that it needed to be as groundbreaking as the team wanted it to be. Hollow Knight, however, was certainly not Christopher's only grind. During the time in which he was brought on by Team Cherry, he was just as hard at work with another two-dimensional side-scroller called Expand, and I've linked the website in the description for that as well in case some of you want to head over and check out his work. The next massive milestone was realized during the engine switch. A particular Unity plugin named Playmaker allowed programming AI to be not only more user-friendly, but surprisingly enough, really expansive. William has even posted before on Team Cherry's blog that he does in fact love using it and does recommend the plugin for programmers of any expertise level. But it's more than just the programming that seemed to have been given an upgrade. Upon porting the game assets over to Unity, the team realized just how much they could expand on their original concept, and how large they really could make this game if they wanted. Sure enough, they took that as an invitation to add more and more content to the game. More visually appealing details, textures, and just all around a better looking game. The before and after images attached on the blog honestly just speak for themselves, and it's massively impressive what a simple change in direction did for this game's aesthetic. Not long after that, Team Cherry posted an announcement, one of the biggest yet, that their game will be headed to PAX Australia that October. They made new connections, friends, new fans were introduced to the game, and they apparently even got to play Cuphead at an earlier point of development as well. It was here where they realized much of the old footage was still being used by multiple outlets to showcase the game, so they fixed that as quickly as they could by releasing Ferocious Foes, the very first Hollow Knight trailer that showcased gameplay built in the Unity engine. They also announced Ghosts and Dream Warriors into the mix as well, a lot of which were designed and written by Kickstarter backers that wanted to see their own creations in the game. Marissa of the Hollow Nest Capital, for instance, was one of these creations. Around the beginning of 2016, the team started sharing its updates quite liberally. The tempo of news and features increased massively as Team Cherry divulged new and interesting information about the game's mechanics, like the charm system, more virtual tours for different areas in the game like the White Palace, and demonstrating the capabilities of a couple boss enemies on their blog, one of which was titled The Broken Wanderer, which would eventually be renamed to Broken Vessel. As it turns out, developing the weapons and animations for the warrior ghosts actually proved to be quite an arduous task, and since they became such a huge component of the game, Team Cherry wanted to ensure that some of these bosses really did feel like bosses that offered really tough and challenging fights. Some of the most challenging in the game, in fact, which was ultimately why they decided that these fights wouldn't be necessary to the completion of the game. They would, however, give you a major benefit if you wanted to, I don't know, say pursue a different ending or something like that. Other additions to the game like more enemies, concept sketches, and even the implementation of backer NPCs like Cloth and Tiso, written respectively by Noah Sturtridge and Tizo Spencer, ended up being revealed as well. This all leads up to the final pre-release trailer for Hollow Knight, Beneath and Beyond, a trailer that showcased some of Hollow Knight's most surreal landscapes, beautiful imagery, and extremely strange, eldritch characters the game had to offer. As the game wrapped up, a new face was to be added to the Hollow Knight project and the final stages of its production. Matt Griffin was arguably the most important asset to the success of Hollow Knight, having previously done massive PR and marketing work for other popular games like Stardew Valley, Interstellaria, and Wanderlust Adventures, an online programmer for Risk of Rain, which, by the way, was another game with a brilliant soundtrack. Matt Griffin was really shaping up to be the agent the team needed to get word of this game off the ground. Interviews with Pixel Rising, D1 DLC, and a mention in Game Informer magazine all seemed to be great evidence that people really were getting interested in this game, but only when Matt took a copy of Hollow Knight to Day of the Devs did interest in the game really begin to throttle skyward. Day of the Devs, if you don't know, is a single-day event in San Francisco hosted by Double Fine and I Am 8-Bit that revolves entirely around prospecting indie games and lesser-known titles. Double Fine was the team that separated themselves from LucasArts ages ago and went on to develop Psychonauts, Brutal Legend, Broken Age, and Grim Fandango Remastered, just to name a few. So, needless to say, attracting a crowd at this convention was a huge deal. In the same blog update, Ari also teases information on a particular game mode that seems to be giving everyone trouble. Not necessarily a new Game Plus mode, but a much harder mode with a modified UA that I'm pretty sure any fan of the game will recognize. This new mode, along with other large-scale additions to the game, really expanded the scope of the final project, and the team has even stated that if you're a completionist for achievements, you might need quite a bit of time on your hands. Another NPC, GG, gets introduced around this time, and this is coupled with some brief insight on how exactly the death mechanic works in Hollow Knight, and this is where the importance of GG and the Shade character is explained a little more clearly. The Shade is the spectral remnant of your knight that you leave behind as you die, and reconnecting with the Shade is extremely important to progress in the game. Following the couple months prior to Hollow Knight's official launch, the news only gets bigger and bigger. The Steam page for Hollow Knight becomes active, a Switch release is confirmed for the game, and fan excitement at this point is probably at the highest it has ever been. The team addresses Nintendo Switch concerns and finally answers that yes, the game will be looking for a release on the Switch, albeit on a later date. The refinement stage of the game becomes much easier as the team takes advantage of really flexible productivity software programs like Slack and Trello so that other people testing the game internally can offer suggestions and point out bugs that would otherwise have been problematic upon release. One of the largest complaints, and also one of the most controversial, was, unsurprisingly, the game's difficulty. Most of the people who tested the game voiced concerns either about how hard the game was, or that the difficulty of the game was pitch perfect and did not need to be adjusted at all. This resulted in a few minor quality of life changes, like the nail attack range being increased, and the linearity of the game just being overall less confusing. Team Cherry did, however, leave in a couple things, like being able to smack enemies on the other side of walls and stuff, because, as they've stated before, they prefer not to mess with smaller bugs such as this because it allows player flexibility, and they don't believe it's in their place to tell players how to grind through the game. One release trailer, some backing from Indie Fund, and 149 enemies later, Hollow Knight is live. And yeah, that number wasn't made up either. They actually confirmed 149 enemies in the vanilla game, even outnumbering the enemy variety in Symphony of the Night, the very figurehead of the genre. And as much of a shock to the team as it was, selling 65,000 copies of that game after only a month seemed pretty impressive when you consider the track record. A team of 3 dudes that went from participating in game jams to just immediately jumping into the spotlight, onto the front page of Reddit, and having ubiquitously positive reviews written about your game. It's quite a big leap, and the rewards only seemed to grow tenfold after that. Collector's editions of the game started being distributed by IndieBox, and there were multiple merchandise manufacturers that wanted to give Hollow Knight their own line of apparel, posters, and other physical items that you could purchase outside of the game. This game had only been out for less than 3 months at this point, and already there was an almost palpable demand for collector's items and other merchandise, which, at least in my opinion, is nothing short of remarkable. Just to really drive home the dedicated passion of this fanbase, there were already people speedrunning this game on a competitive level before the first content update even came out. Summer Games Done Quick 2017 actually saw this done when Twitch speedrunner and Steamer Urulin, which at that point gave the game even more publicity than it already had with its overwhelmingly positive reviews. The community also took to their own computers and after only a few months had fully developed mods like Lightbringer and Glass Soul that could be added to the game. Team Cherry said in a blog update that having mods made for your game is quite possibly the highest honor a game could ever receive. But if we can backpedal for just a little bit, I did mention free content updates for the game, and there's really no way to talk about Hollow Knight without addressing these updates, so let's go on ahead and talk about those right now. Hidden Dreams was Hollow Knight's first free content update, and having been released after only around 5 months after the vanilla game, it really gave fans an idea on how quickly and how fervently the team behind this game could really work. Hidden Dreams adds 2 new bosses, a new quality of life mechanic called the Dream Gate that makes backtracking much less of a hassle. If you felt returning to an area was necessary, the Dream Gate would prove to be a valuable tool if you didn't want to take stag stations all the way to where you needed to go. Remember when people tried to lay a Dream Gate next to the Traitor Child's grave and try to cheat that flower quest? Yeah, unfortunately that didn't work. They thought ahead of that. The Grimm Troupe was the next update to launch, and with the arrival of even more game-changing features, new charms, and a new quest line where Hallownest was visited by a strange organization of creatures and monsters, fronted by a tall and sinister figure named Grimm. This update had its fair share of new bosses and new challenges, but it seemed to be very clear that this update was meant to be extremely more significant than the former. New map markers, new powers and abilities, and a new way to get rid of all your pesky geo because you've been stockpiling since the vanilla release, and a ton of new music. Team Cherry's attendance at PAX West, their final shipment of Kickstarter backer rewards, and more info on a Switch release also seemed to dominate most of their updates. But one announcement they for sure couldn't hold back on for long after the Grimm Troupe was details on the third and final free content update, Gods and Glory. Now, because of a copyright hiccup, the third content update eventually saw itself go through a rename to Godmaster. This was indisputably Team Cherry's largest free contribution to the game since its entire release. The final chapter of the Knight's story, and at least in terms of size, a good league or two above the former content packs. 5 Pantheon rooms await your knight to do battle. and there are a ton of new bosses, including the Nail Masters, the Nail Sage Sly himself, a winged version of Nosk, Jesus fucking Christ, and the Pure Vessel, who is presumably the Hollow Knight only pre-infection. The final content pack even teases a new 5th ending involving an altercation between Hornet and a mysterious enemy which is again presumed to be the Hollow Knight because the details on the nail are the same details as the weapon of the Pure Vessel. But anyway, that's irrelevant. I'm not about to turn this into a lore discussion. Now, I seem to have skipped over a pretty critical update because I mentioned Godmaster as the 3rd DLC, but I'm only doing that because people are still at odds over where exactly the Lifeblood update falls in terms of new content packs versus a standard quality of life update. Team Cherry was already far into the development of Godmaster before they realized an update with a few crucial bug fixes was definitely necessary, especially for a successful Nintendo Switch release later that June. And in true Team Cherry fashion, they also couldn't resist adding a couple new pieces of content along the way. This update had technically 2 new bosses if you count the Traitor Lord rework, which is why fans are so conflicted on whether or not it's technically the 3rd content pack, with Godmaster being the 4th. I see it as a minor content update because it added a bunch of new things outside of just adding a couple bosses, so I'm totally willing to count it into the rest of the packs. The release of Godmaster also gave way to the Voidheart Edition release on PS4 and Xbox One, which included all 4 of these updates along with the vanilla game. 4 updates later, Hollow Knight has evolved from standard platformer to a masterfully well-rounded game. It really does feel big. And that's certainly not to say it wasn't giant or exciting to play before, but if you do get the Voidheart Edition, which you totally should because I want to talk to you guys about it, then playing the main story first, I think, is the way to go, because seeing Team Cherry's creative evolution with these content packs is really something you should experience in the game chronologically. Hollow Knight is the product of years of development and even more years of refinement and maintenance behind the scenes to finally make it what it is. My hope with the confirmed and upcoming Hornet DLC is that Team Cherry will surprise us even more by implementing what they've learned and just really knocking it out of the park more than what we thought was possible. Hollow Knight's hand-drawn art style and implicitly told story I understand is not everyone's cup of tea, but it certainly was mine, and it's more than worthy of its praise. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. I'm Rusty, and I'll see you next time. Take care, guys.